somewhere around the year 1200 CE. Three civilizations that had no known contact with one another entered crisis. The Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, the Ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest, the Norse settlements of Greenland. Three worlds, three silences. Collapse is the word we often reach for, though the reality, as always, is more complicated than any single word allows. One built a city of water in the jungle, a city so vast and so dependent on the precision of its own engineering that a generation of drought placed unbearable stress on what 7 centuries of kings had built. One carved roads into desert stone and raised apartment buildings, 4 stories high, in a landscape that offered almost nothing, and then walked away from all of it so completely that the people who came after them had no memory of who had been there first. One sailed to the edge of the known world and stayed for 400 years, farming the same frozen valleys, trading wool and walrus ivory with a Europe that was slowly forgetting they existed. And then one winter they simply stopped answering. This is not a story about what we know. It is a story about the shape of what we don't. This video does not argue that one single event destroyed all 3 societies. What it explores is something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. Why several complex societies, separated by oceans and deserts and languages, entered periods of crisis, transformation, or abandonment during the same broad century, and what that pattern, if it is a pattern, might mean. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. You don't need to hold on tightly. The past is patient. It has been waiting for a very long time. It can wait a little longer. Chapter 1. The same century. 3 worlds apart. Before the silence, there was sound. In the year 1200 CE, if you could somehow stand at the center of the world and turn slowly in every direction, what you would see would not match anything the history books of a later era would lead you to expect. You would not see a world divided neatly into the advanced and the primitive, the civilized and the wild. You would see complexity everywhere. Cities and trade networks and religious traditions and agricultural systems of extraordinary sophistication spread across every inhabited continent. Each one, the product of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Each one humming with the particular energy of a society that believes, as all living societies believe, that it will continue. The Khmer Empire had been building for nearly 6 centuries by that point. Its capital at Angkor, in what is now Cambodia, was not simply the largest city in Southeast Asia. It was, by most estimates, one of the largest pre-industrial urban complexes on the surface of the earth. The Temple of Angkor Wat, commissioned by King Suryavarman II in the early 12th century, was already complete. It covered more than 400 acres. Its central tower rose more than 200 feet above the jungle floor. It was oriented to the west, toward the setting sun, toward the realm of the dead. And its walls were covered in bas-relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu cosmology that stretched for nearly half a mile without interruption. Angkor Wat was not the only structure of its kind. It was one of dozens. The Khmer had been building on this scale for generations, and they were not finished. 12,000 miles away, in the high desert of what is now the American Southwest, the people we call the Ancestral Puebloans had been transforming a landscape of mesas and canyons into something that had no parallel anywhere else on Earth. Chaco Canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico was the center of a regional system that stretched across an area roughly the size of Ireland. The great houses of Chaco, Pueblo Bonito, Chetro Kettle, Pueblo del Arroyo, were not villages in any ordinary sense. Pueblo Bonito alone contained more than 600 rooms and stood 4 stories high in places. It had been under construction, with interruptions, for nearly 200 years. The roads that connected Chaco to outlying communities were engineering achievements that still puzzle researchers today. They ran perfectly straight across the landscape, cutting through mesas rather than around them, maintaining a consistent width of 30 feet for distances of dozens of miles. They were not paths worn by repeated foot traffic. They were built, planned, surveyed, and constructed with a geometric precision that speaks of centralized authority and long-term vision. And in the far North Atlantic, on an island of ice and volcanic rock that no human being had seen before the 9th century CE, a community of Norse farmers was doing something that should not, by any reasonable calculation, have been possible. They were surviving. Not just surviving, but building. The Norse settlements of Greenland, established by Eric the Red around the year 985 CE, had grown over the following centuries into a functioning agricultural society of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people at their height. They had churches, at least one of which was built of stone. They had a bishop. They participated in the European economy, trading walrus, ivory, and polar bear skins and live Arctic animals to buyers in Norway and Iceland and beyond. They were, by any measure, a community that had chosen one of the harshest environments on Earth and had found a way to make it work. For 400 years, they made it work. 3 worlds, no known contact between them, no shared language, no shared religion, no shared understanding of what a city was or what a road was for or what it meant to build a life at the edge of everything. And yet, within the span of roughly 100 to 150 years, all 3 of these societies entered a period from which they would not recover in any form recognizable to what they had been. Collapse is the word we often reach for. It is a word worth pausing on, because it carries implications that the evidence does not always support. Collapse suggests suddenness. It suggests totality. It suggests that one day a civilization was there, and the next day it was not. The way a building falls, when the supports give way all at once. But history rarely works that way. And the 3 stories we are about to follow are not stories of sudden disappearance. They are stories of unraveling, of systems that had been optimized for a particular set of conditions, encountering conditions they were not built to handle, of knowledge that was lost, not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow and quiet erosion that took generations to complete, of people who woke up every morning and tried to solve the problems in front of them, and who, for reasons that historians still argue about, were unable to solve them fast enough. Collapse is the word we often reach for. What actually happened to each of these societies was different, messier, and in some ways more interesting than the word suggests. The Khmer did not disappear. Their descendants are the Cambodian people of today, and the traditions of Angkor, however transformed by the centuries that followed, did not vanish from the earth. What ended was not a people but a particular form of political and hydraulic organization, a system so elaborate and so precisely calibrated that when it began to fail, the failure spread faster than anyone could contain it. The Ancestral Puebloans did not disappear either. The Hopi, the Zuni, the various Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley are their descendants, and many of them maintain cultural and spiritual connections to the places their ancestors built and left. What ended was the particular pattern of regional organization centered on Chaco Canyon, a pattern that had pulled communities together across an enormous landscape and that, when it dissolved completely. The Norse of Greenland are a different case. Their settlements were abandoned. The people who had built those stone churches and traded that walrus ivory did not transform into something else in the same place. They left, or they died, or some combination of the two. And, by the early 15th century, there was no one left to answer when European ships arrived looking for them. What happened to them? Exactly. And why it happened differently than what happened to the Khmer and the Puebloans. is one of the most persistent and genuinely unresolved questions in the study of this period. This video does not claim to answer that question. What it does is follow each of these three stories carefully enough that the question becomes visible in its full complexity, and then ask what the three stories look like when you hold them up together in the same light. The same century. 3 worlds apart. Before we can understand what ended, we need to understand what existed. We need to feel the weight of what was built, and what was learned, and what was loved, before we can begin to understand what it meant to lose it. So we begin at the beginning, not with the silence, with the sound. Chapter 2. Angkor, the city that drank the sky. There is a moment. If you approach Angkor Wat from the west in the early morning, when the sun has not yet cleared, the tree line and the stone towers are still in shadow. When the reflection of the temple appears in the long rectangular reservoir that stretches before it, and the building seems to exist simultaneously in the sky and in the water, as though it were not built on the earth at all but suspended between two versions of itself. The Khmer who built it would not have found this accidental. They built it that way. The reservoir was not decorative. Nothing at Angkor was purely decorative. The Khmer Empire was, at its core, a hydraulic civilization, a society whose power, whose agriculture, whose very identity was organized around the control and distribution of water in a landscape where water came in violent abundance for half the year and disappeared almost entirely for the other half. The genius of Angkor was not the temples, extraordinary as they were. The genius was the system that made the temples possible. To understand what the Khmer built, you have to understand the landscape they built it in. The Tonle Sap is a lake in the heart of Cambodia, connected to the Mekong River by a channel of the same name. During the dry season, it is a modest body of water. But, when the monsoon rains come and the Mekong floods, something extraordinary happens. The river pushes back up the channel and into the lake, reversing the flow, and the lake expands to nearly 5 or 6 times its dry season size, flooding the surrounding forests and depositing enormous quantities of nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain. Then the monsoon ends. The flow reverses again, and the lake retreats, leaving behind some of the most fertile agricultural land in Southeast Asia. The Khmer did not merely observe this cycle, they engineered it. Beginning in the 9th century CE, the Khmer constructed a hydraulic infrastructure of considerable scale and sophistication. They built barrays, enormous rectangular reservoirs, some of them several miles long, designed to capture the monsoon floodwaters and release them gradually during the dry season. The West Barray at Angkor, constructed in the 11th century, is approximately 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. It holds enough water to irrigate a significant portion of the agricultural land surrounding the city. It still holds water today. They built canals, connecting the berries to smaller channels, which connected in turn to individual rice paddies spread across the floodplain. They built sluice gates to control the flow. They built embankments to manage drainage. The entire system was designed to give Khmer farmers something the natural cycle alone could not provide: a reliable and controllable supply of water throughout the year, independent of the monsoon's timing and intensity. The result was the ability to grow rice not once a year, but potentially 2 or 3 times a year. Rice surplus was power. Rice surplus meant that not everyone needed to farm. Some could build, some could administer, some could carve half a mile of bas-relief into sandstone walls with a precision that modern archaeologists still study with something close to reverence. The hydraulic system was the foundation on which everything else at Angkor rested. The temples and the roads and the royal courts and the vast administrative apparatus of an empire that, at its height, controlled territory, stretching from the South China Sea to the borders of what is now Myanmar. Angkor Wat was commissioned by King Suryavarman II, who ruled in the early 12th century. It was dedicated to Vishnu, the Hindu god of preservation. The outer enclosure measures approximately 5,000 feet by 4,000 feet. The moat that surrounds it is nearly 600 feet wide. The temple rises through a series of ascending terraces, each representing a level of the Hindu cosmos, to the central sanctuary at the top. The bas-relief galleries depict scenes from Hindu epics and Khmer military history with such narrative complexity and such density of human figures that scholars have spent careers studying individual panels without exhausting their content. The sandstone blocks used in the construction, more than 5 million of them, by some estimates. They were quarried at a mountain range some 25 miles to the northeast and transported to the site by a combination of canals, sledges, and human labor on a scale that required the coordination of tens of thousands of workers over decades. Angkor Wat was only one temple in a city that contained dozens. Bayon, the state temple of King Jayavarman VII, built in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, features 54 towers, each carved with enormous faces, serene and slightly smiling, gazing outward in the 4 cardinal directions. More than 200 of these faces look out from the towers of Bayon, and no one is entirely certain whose face they represent, whether it is the Buddha, or Jayavarman himself, or some synthesis of the two that expressed the king's understanding of his own divine nature. Taprom, left deliberately unrestored as a reminder of what the jungle does to human ambition, has been slowly consumed by the roots of strangler figs and silk cotton trees over the centuries since it was abandoned. The roots move through the stone like slow water, finding every crack, widening every joint, pressing walls apart with a patience that makes the stone look fragile. Standing in Ta Prohm today, you are watching two things simultaneously: the temple that was built and the forest that is reclaiming it. Lidar surveys conducted between 2012 and 2015 by the Cambodian Archaeological Lidar Initiative revealed the full extent of Angkor in a way that ground-based archaeology had not been able to. The surveys showed a low-density urban landscape spreading across an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers, making it one of the largest pre-industrial urban complexes ever identified. Population estimates for Greater Angkor vary considerably depending on methodology, but figures possibly approaching 1 million people in the broader urban region have been proposed by researchers working with the LiDAR data. These are not settled numbers. The archaeology of low-density urban landscapes is genuinely difficult, and different scholars make different assumptions. What is not in dispute is the scale. What is not in dispute is the ambition. At its height, around the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Angkor was one of the most complex and productive urban systems on Earth. It had been sustained for centuries by a hydraulic infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication, maintained by a bureaucratic and religious establishment of considerable size and organizational capacity, and then, with a slowness that made it nearly invisible to the people living through it, the system that had made everything possible began to fail. The first signs were not dramatic. They rarely are. The hydraulic network that the Khmer had built over centuries was not a static system. It required constant maintenance. Channels silted up and needed to be dredged. Embankments eroded and needed to be rebuilt. Sluice gates wore out and needed to be replaced. The entire system depended on a continuous investment of organized human labor. And that investment, in turn, depended on a political structure capable of mobilizing and directing that labor. When the political structure began to weaken, the maintenance began to fall behind. When the maintenance fell behind, the hydraulic network began to degrade. When the hydraulic network degraded, the agricultural surplus that fed the city began to contract. When the surplus contracted, the political structure weakened further. The spiral, once it began, was very difficult to reverse. Climate records extracted from tree rings and sediment cores in the region document something that made this spiral considerably worse. The 13th and 14th centuries in mainland Southeast Asia were marked by a pattern of intense and prolonged drought punctuated by episodes of catastrophic flooding, a pattern consistent with disrupted monsoon activity. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by Brendan Buckley of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, used tree ring records from teak and other species across mainland Southeast Asia to reconstruct monsoon variability over several centuries. The results showed extended drought periods in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, with episodes of intense rainfall in between that would have overwhelmed degraded hydraulic infrastructure and accelerated erosion. For a city whose entire existence depended on managing water precisely, this struck the one system the city could not function without. Lidar analysis has revealed evidence of hasty modifications to the hydraulic network, channels redirected, embankments reinforced unevenly, the infrastructure patched and altered in ways that suggest engineers working urgently to address problems that were growing faster than the solutions. Some of these modifications appear to have made things worse, creating new vulnerabilities in a system designed as an integrated whole that did not respond well to piecemeal repair. By the mid-15th century, the administrative center of the Khmer state had shifted south and east to the region around what is now Phnom Penh. The temples of Angkor were not destroyed. They were not burned or deliberately demolished. They were left. The population dispersed. The hydraulic network that had fed the city was no longer maintained. The jungle, held back for centuries by the organized labor of a functioning city, began its slow return. The faces on the towers of Bayonne continued to gaze outward in the four cardinal directions. There was simply no one left to look back. Chapter 3. The Desert Architects. There is a road in the desert of northwestern New Mexico that goes nowhere. It begins, or rather, it can be traced beginning, at the edge of Chaco Canyon, in a landscape of red and tan sandstone, where the wind has been working on the rock for so long that the cliffs look like they were shaped by something with intentions. The road runs north. It runs straight, with a straightness that is not the straightness of a path worn by people walking, the easiest route between 2 points. It is the straightness of something surveyed, something planned, something that someone decided should go in exactly this direction and not 1 degree to either side. It is 30 feet wide. In places it is bordered by low earthen berms. In places it is cut directly into the bedrock of the mesa, requiring the removal of enormous quantities of material with no tools more advanced than wooden digging sticks and baskets. It runs for miles, and then it stops. Not at another great house, not at a water source, not at any feature of the landscape that an outside observer would identify as a destination. It simply ends. And the question of where it was going, and why it was built with such precision in a landscape that punishes the expenditure of unnecessary energy, remains genuinely open. The people who built that road are known to archaeologists as the Ancestral Puebloans, a term adopted in recent decades to replace an older name that was not theirs. Their descendants, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the various Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley, prefer Ancestral Puebloans. And that preference reflects something important. These were not a vanished people. They were ancestors. The connection between what was built at Chaco Canyon in the 11th and 12th centuries and the living communities of the American Southwest today is not merely archaeological. It is familial. It is spiritual. It is present. The Ancestral Puebloans had been living in the Colorado Plateau region for centuries before Chaco Canyon became the center of anything. They were not newcomers to the desert. They understood it in ways that can only come from generations of accumulated knowledge. Knowledge of where water collected after rain, of which plants indicated the presence of moisture below the surface. Of how to read the landscape for the signs that meant the difference between a good year and a catastrophic one. They grew corn, beans, and squash in a landscape that receives on average less than 9 inches of rain per year. They built check dams in the arroyos to slow runoff and encourage it to sink into the soil. They built small reservoirs to collect what little rain did fall. They oriented their fields and their buildings to take maximum advantage of solar heating during the cold winters and shading during the hot summers. Every element of their relationship with the landscape was the product of knowledge earned over generations of living in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. And then, beginning around 850 CE and accelerating through the 10th and 11th centuries, something changed. Chaco Canyon became the center of a regional system that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. Pueblo Bonito is the largest and best studied of the Chaco Great Houses. Construction began around 850 CE and continued in multiple phases for nearly 200 years. At its completion, it contained somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms arranged in a D-shaped plan that followed the curve of the canyon wall behind it. The rooms rose to 4 stories in places. The walls were built using a masonry technique in which a rubble core is faced on both sides with carefully shaped and precisely fitted stone, creating a surface of considerable visual sophistication. Different periods of construction can be identified by subtle variations in the masonry style, creating what archaeologists call the architectural biography of the building. The timber used in the construction tells its own story. The great houses required enormous quantities of large wooden beams for their roof construction. Chaco Canyon itself has almost no trees of the size required. The timber was imported, carried by human labor, from forests more than 50 miles away. Researchers using tree ring analysis have matched individual beams in the Chaco Great Houses to specific source forests at considerable distances from the canyon, confirming that the Chaco system was able to organize the movement of heavy materials across a landscape with no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals. Only human carriers. Only human organization. The canyon contains at least 12 large great houses and hundreds of smaller structures. The great houses are positioned with what appears to be deliberate attention to solar and lunar alignments. Fajada Butte, a prominent rock formation at the southeast end of the canyon, hosts a solar marker arranged so that daggers of light fall precisely on the centers and edges of carved spirals at the solstices and equinoxes. Whether this was a functional calendar, a ritual installation, or both, it represents a level of astronomical knowledge and a commitment to encoding that knowledge permanently in stone that speaks of a culture in which the movements of the sky were not merely observed but considered essential. The roads that radiate outward from Chaco Canyon are among the most debated features of the entire system. More than 400 miles of roads have been identified through aerial photography, lidar, and ground survey, connecting Chaco to outlying communities scattered across an area of roughly 60,000 square miles. The roads are remarkable not only for their precision and their scale, but for their apparent indifference to the most efficient route. Where a path worn by casual foot traffic would naturally curve around obstacles, the Chaco roads go through them. Where a practical trail would descend a slope gradually, the Chaco roads descend it directly, sometimes with constructed staircases cut into the rock face. This insistence on straightness has generated considerable scholarly debate. Some researchers have proposed that the roads served primarily a functional purpose, facilitating the movement of people, goods, and information between Chaco and the outlying communities. Others have argued that the straightness itself was the point, that the roads expressed something about the Chacoan understanding of the relationship between the center and the periphery, between the human and the cosmic, that could not be expressed in a road that bent around hills. The two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The goods that moved along these roads speak for themselves. Turquoise, in quantities, that astonish researchers. More than 200,000 pieces have been recovered from the canyon, much of it worked into ornaments and offerings. The source of the turquoise has been traced through chemical analysis to the Cerrillos Hills near what is now Santa Fe, roughly 150 miles to the southeast. Machos, the large, colorful parrots native to Mexico, were kept alive at Chaco. Their feathers used in ritual contexts that connected the canyon to Mesoamerican religious traditions far to the south. Cacao residue has been identified in ceramic vessels at Pueblo Bonito, the earliest known evidence of chocolate consumption north of Mexico, suggesting trade connections that extended deep into Mesoamerica. Chaco Canyon was not simply a local ceremonial center. It was a node in a network that stretched across much of western North America. And the people who lived there, and who built it, and who maintained it, left no written records. The exact language or languages spoken at Chaco are not recoverable from the archaeological record. The names of the leaders who organized the construction of Pueblo Bonito are unknown. The stories they told about the spiral petroglyphs on Fajada Butte, about the meaning of the roads and the purpose of the great houses, about the relationship between the turquoise offerings and the macaw feathers and the astronomical alignments. All of it is silence. What the archaeology does tell us is that by the mid-12th century, something had changed. Tree ring records from the beams of Chaco great houses, analyzed by researchers at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, document a severe and prolonged drought in the San Juan Basin, beginning around 1130 CE and continuing for several decades. The last large-scale construction at Chaco Canyon appears to have occurred in the mid-12th century. After approximately 1140 to 1150 CE, the evidence for new construction in the canyon largely ceases. The population began to decline. By approximately 1200 CE, Chaco Canyon was largely depopulated, not burned, not destroyed, simply left. The great houses stood empty, their rooms still containing the accumulated material of generations of occupation. The stone tools, and the broken pottery, and the macaw bones, and the turquoise ornaments that archaeologists would spend the following century carefully excavating and cataloging and arguing about. The population did not disappear. It moved north to the Mesa Verde region of southwestern Colorado, east toward the Rio Grande Valley, toward the communities that would become the Pueblo peoples of the historical era. The knowledge that had built Pueblo Bonito did not vanish from the earth. It traveled with the people who carried it, and it found new expressions in new places. Even as the canyon that had been its center fell quiet, what ended at Chaco was not a people. It was a way of organizing the world. The road still runs north across the desert. The straightness is still there, visible in aerial photographs, cut into the bedrock in places where the wind has not yet covered it, going nowhere, or going somewhere that we no longer know how to name. Chapter 4. The Furthest North. There is a farm in Greenland that has been under ice for 1,000 years. Not beneath the sea, beneath the glacier, a pasture that Norse farmers cleared in the 10th century, pulling rocks from the soil by hand and stacking them into the low stone walls that still mark field boundaries in Scandinavia today. Now lies under ice that has been advancing slowly since the climate began to cool in the 13th and 14th centuries. The walls are still there, under the ice. Researchers know this because in warmer years, when the glacier margin retreats slightly, the edges of the old field systems become briefly visible before the ice returns. 1,000 years of cold, pressing down on a pasture that someone once considered worth clearing. That image says something about the Norse Greenland story that no amount of historical analysis quite captures. These were not explorers passing through. These were farmers. People who looked at one of the harshest landscapes on the North Atlantic Rim and saw not an obstacle, but a place where they could build something permanent. They were, in this sense, exactly like the Khmer engineers who looked at a jungle flood cycle and saw the architecture of a city, or the ancestral Puebloans who looked at a canyon in the high desert and saw the center of a world. The impulse was the same. The commitment was the same. The faith that what was being built would outlast the builders was the same. It did not outlast them, but it lasted longer than most people realize. The Norse presence in Greenland began in the year 985 CE, when Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, led a fleet of approximately 14 ships carrying settlers, livestock, and everything necessary to begin a new community in a land he had spent 3 years exploring alone. He called it Greenland. The southwestern coast where the settlements were established does in fact have areas of genuinely green pasture during the short Arctic summer. It was not a fraudulent name. It was the name of the part of the island that his settlers would occupy for the next 4 centuries. The settlements organized themselves into 2 clusters. The eastern settlement in the far southwest grew to become the larger and longer-lived of the 2, containing perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people at its height, and at least 190 farms identified by archaeological survey. The western settlement, several hundred miles further north, was smaller, and it was the first to be abandoned, sometime in the mid-14th century. These were not temporary camps or seasonal outposts. They were communities built for permanence. The Norse Greenlanders built in stone and turf, using construction techniques well adapted to a treeless landscape where the nearest structural timber was Iceland or Norway, hundreds of miles of open ocean away. Their longhouses followed a pattern recognizable across the Norse world. A central hall with benches along the walls for sleeping, a hearth in the middle for heat and cooking. Outbuildings for livestock attached directly to the main structure so that the body heat of the animals could help warm the living quarters during the long Arctic winters. In the eastern settlement, the cathedral at Gardar was built of dressed stone and was large enough to seat several hundred people. There was a bishop's residence. There were farms with multiple outbuildings, constructed with careful attention to drainage and insulation that comes from generations of experience with cold. The Greenlanders were Christians, having been converted around the year 1000 CE, and they maintained their connection to the wider Christian world with a consistency that speaks of how seriously they took both their faith and their European identity. They paid tithes to the Church in Rome. They participated in the Crusades. They received episcopal appointments from the Archbishop of Nidaros in Norway. The last recorded bishop of Greenland was appointed in 1368 CE, though it is not clear he ever actually traveled to his diocese. Trade was the lifeline that connected the Greenland settlements to the wider world. Before the Portuguese opened trade routes to sub-Saharan Africa in the 15th century, the primary source of ivory for European craftsmen was the walrus of the North Atlantic. Greenland walrus ivory was prized for its quality, and the Norse Greenlanders built their economic existence around hunting it. Along with polar bear skins, live falcons, trained for aristocratic hunting, and the occasional live polar bear cub destined for a royal menagerie in Europe. These were luxury goods for which there was a consistent and reliable market, and that market sustained the Greenland settlements through the first 2 centuries of their existence. The Greenlanders were also not alone in Greenland. The Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, had been expanding eastward across Arctic North America for several centuries before they reached Greenland. Arriving in the far north of the island around 1200 CE and moving gradually southward, the Norse and the Thule almost certainly encountered each other, and there is documentary and archaeological evidence for both trade and conflict between the 2 communities. Norse texts describe encounters with people they called Skraelings, a term used for both the indigenous peoples encountered during the brief Norse colonization of Newfoundland and for the Inuit of Greenland. What the nature of those encounters meant, and what the Greenlanders chose to learn or not learn from people who had been living in Arctic conditions for far longer than they had, is a question that sits at the center of the puzzle of what eventually happened to the Norse settlements. It is a question we will return to. For now, it is enough to sit with the image of this community as it existed at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries. Stone churches in a landscape of ice and rock. Farms with cattle and sheep browsing on summer pastures. Ships leaving for Norway with walrus ivory and returning with iron and timber, and the particular thread of connection to the wider European world that the Greenlanders appear to have valued intensely, perhaps more intensely than was entirely practical. They were at the edge of everything. And for 400 years, the edge held. The last written record of the Norse Greenland community comes from 1408 CE, a document recording a marriage that took place at Havelsey Church in the eastern settlement. The church still stands, or rather, its stone walls still stand. Roofless now, the largest surviving Norse structure in Greenland. The record of the marriage is detailed and specific. It names the couple, describes the ceremony, notes the witnesses. It is the kind of document that communities produce when they believe their institutions are functioning and their records matter. 6 years later, a ship from Norway reported finding the western settlement completely abandoned. The eastern settlement persisted somewhat longer, but by the mid-15th century, when European explorers began looking for the Norse communities that their maps still showed in Greenland, there was no one to find. The pasture under the glacier is still there. The stone walls are still there, waiting for a warmer year. Chapter 5. When the Rain Stopped. Before we follow these 3 stories toward their endings, we need to spend time with the climate. Not because climate is the whole answer. It is not. The story of each of these societies is too complicated, too human, too full of choices and accidents and contingencies for any single force to explain it completely. But climate is part of every story we are telling tonight. And in each case, it is a more specific and better documented part than the popular accounts of these transformations usually acknowledge. The science of past climate has changed dramatically in the last 3 decades. It used to be that climate historians worked primarily with written records, chronicles and annals and agricultural documents that mentioned unusual droughts or floods or harvest failures. Valuable, but fragmentary, limited to periods and places where writing existed. For the Ancestral Puebloans, who left no written records, essentially useless. For the Khmer, whose written records focus almost entirely on religious and royal matters. Only occasional glimpses. What changed was the development of proxy climate records, physical materials that preserve information about past climate conditions in forms that can be measured and analyzed with precision. Tree rings are the most widely used proxy. Trees grow faster in good years and slower in bad ones, and the width of each annual ring preserves a record of the growing conditions in that particular year. A long-lived tree can contain centuries of climate data in its rings. And where living trees are not available, preserved ancient timber from buildings and archaeological sites can extend the record further. The Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona maintains one of the largest collections of tree ring data in the world, and the science of tree ring dating developed there has transformed our understanding of past climate in the American Southwest. One ring, 1 year, one precise measurement of how much or how little the world gave. Ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet preserve a different kind of record. Each year's snowfall compresses into a distinct layer. And, within those layers, researchers can measure isotopes that reflect the temperature at the time the snow fell. Atmospheric gases trapped in air bubbles. Particles of volcanic ash that can be matched to specific eruptions. And chemical signatures of distant wildfires and dust storms. The Greenland ice cores extend the climate record back more than 100,000 years. And for the period of Norse settlement, they provide a detailed and annually resolved record of temperature and atmospheric conditions. Sediment cores from lake beds and ocean floors preserve pollen, microscopic organisms, and chemical markers that reflect vegetation and precipitation over centuries and millennia. Cave formations incorporate isotopic signals that reflect the amount and timing of rainfall in the regions above them. These are quiet records, patient ones. They do not announce themselves. They wait to be read. And what all of these sources have shown, with a convergence that has become clearer with each decade of new research, is that the century between approximately 1200 and 1300 CE was a period of significant and, in some regions, severe climate disruption across much of the northern hemisphere. For the ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest, the tree ring record is extraordinarily detailed. The San Juan Basin has been the subject of intensive tree ring research for nearly a century, and the climate reconstruction that has emerged is one of the most precisely dated climate records available for any pre-Columbian North American society. What the tree rings show is this: the decades of Chaco Canyon's greatest fluorescence, roughly 1050 to 1130 CE, coincide with a period of relatively reliable rainfall in the San Juan Basin. Not abundant rainfall by any standard, but consistent enough that a society with sophisticated water management strategies could build and sustain a regional system of considerable complexity. The margin was always thin. The difference between a viable agricultural year and a catastrophic one could be as little as 2 or 3 inches of rain. 2 or 3 inches, the width of a hand. Beginning around 1130 CE, the tree rings record a shift, a prolonged drought, extending with some interruptions through approximately 1180 CE. Reduced the reliability of rainfall on which the Chaco system depended. This was not a single bad year, or even a single bad decade. It was a multi-generational stress event in a landscape with almost no buffer. Then, beginning in 1276 CE and extending through 1299 CE, the tree rings record what researchers call the Great Drought, a drought period spanning roughly 23 years of below-average precipitation in the Colorado Plateau region. This event has been one of the most precisely documented climate episodes in pre-Columbian North American history, and its timing coincides almost exactly with the final depopulation of the Mesa Verde region, the last major concentration of ancestral Puebloan communities in the northern Colorado Plateau. 23 years. A child born at the beginning of the Great Drought would have been a grandparent before the rains returned in any reliable sense. By 1300 CE, the northern San Juan region, which had been home to tens of thousands of people for centuries, was effectively empty. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, occupied for generations, were abandoned. The population had moved south and east, toward the Rio Grande Valley, toward the communities that would become the Pueblo peoples of the historical era. The Great Drought did not cause this migration in any simple mechanical sense. People do not abandon their homes the moment rainfall decreases. The decision to leave a place that has been home for generations is never made easily. And the archaeological record suggests that the depopulation of the northern Colorado Plateau unfolded over decades. Not a single mass movement triggered by a single bad year. But the climate record and the archaeological record align in a way that is not coincidental. For the Khmer Empire and the fate of Angkor, the climate record comes from a different set of sources. The tree ring study, led by Brendan Buckley, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, used rings from long-lived cypress trees preserved in lake beds and archaeological sites across mainland Southeast Asia to reconstruct monsoon variability over several centuries. The reconstruction revealed 2 extended drought periods affecting the region in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, separated by episodes of intense and potentially destructive flooding. A subsequent study published in Science Advances in 2020, led by researchers from the University of Sydney, Combined lidar analysis of Angkor's hydraulic network with sediment core data from the city's reservoirs. The sediment cores told a story in layers. Deep layers with fine, consistent sedimentation, the signature of a well-maintained system. Then, layers showing coarser, more irregular deposition, reduced maintenance, periodic flooding. Then layers showing the signature of abandonment, the rapid infilling that occurs when a channel is no longer being actively managed. The picture that emerges is one of a hydraulic infrastructure caught between two kinds of climate stress. During drought periods, the reservoirs were not being adequately replenished. During the flood episodes that punctuated the droughts, the channels and embankments were being damaged by volumes of water they had not been designed to handle. A system built to manage water was being unmade by water's unpredictability. For Norse Greenland, the climate story is told primarily by the Greenland ice cores and by pollen records from lake sediments in the settlement areas. What the ice cores show is a gradual but consistent cooling of the North Atlantic region beginning in the 13th century and accelerating in the 14th. A shift associated with what climatologists call the onset of the Little Ice Age. The cooling was not dramatic by the standards of full glacial cycles. Average temperatures in Greenland during this period were perhaps 1 to 2 degrees Celsius lower than they had been during the warmer centuries that preceded it. 1 to 2 degrees does not sound like much. In a landscape operating at the absolute margin of viable agriculture, 1 to 2 degrees is the difference between a hay harvest sufficient to carry livestock through the winter and a harvest that falls short. It is the difference between a growing season long enough to ripen grain and a season that ends before the grain is ready. It is the difference between sea ice that clears the shipping lanes in summer and sea ice that does not. The pollen records from lake sediments in the eastern settlement area document a story that is almost unbearably specific. They show a gradual decline in the pollen of agricultural plants, cereal grains, and hay grasses, beginning in the 14th century and accelerating in the 15th. They show an increase in the pollen of plants associated with abandonment, the weeds and pioneer species that colonize disturbed ground when the farming stops. They show the moment. Not precisely, but within a few decades, when the cultivated landscape of the Norse Eastern settlement became something else. The climate record, across all three cases, tells a consistent story. These societies were stressed by climate in ways that were real, documented, and severe. But here is where honesty requires a careful step. Climate stress explains why these societies face difficulties. It does not fully explain why those difficulties led to the outcomes they did. Other societies have faced comparable or worse climate stress and have not dissolved. The Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley survived the Great Drought, adapting to new locations with better water access. The Inuit of Greenland lived in the same landscape as the Norse Greenlanders, in the same cooling climate, and they did not abandon their settlements. Climate created the pressure. What each of these societies did with that pressure, the choices made and not made, the adaptations attempted and not attempted, the social and political responses that either held communities together or allowed them to fracture. Those are the questions that the climate record alone cannot answer. For those answers, we have to go deeper, into the human factor. The rain stopped. What happened next was not determined by the rain. Chapter 6. The Human Factor. Climate creates pressure. People create responses. And the responses, it turns out, are often more revealing than the pressure itself. Because the same stress applied to different societies produces different outcomes, and the differences tell you something about the societies that no amount of climate data alone can reveal. They tell you about the internal logic of each system, the values and assumptions and power structures that determined how communities made decisions when the margin for error had disappeared. We begin with Angkor. The Khmer Empire of the 12th and 13th centuries was organized around a concept of kingship that had no separation between the political and the sacred. The king was not merely a ruler who performed religious duties. He was, in the Khmer, understanding, the axis around which the cosmic order turned. The great temple mountains of Angkor were not expressions of royal vanity in any simple sense. They were the physical embodiment of a cosmological claim. The temple was the mountain at the center of the universe. The king who built it was the god who inhabited that mountain. This was a theology of legitimacy. And like all theologies of legitimacy, it worked well when things were going well and became a liability when they were not. The construction of temples was not merely a religious act. It was a political one. A king who built a great temple demonstrated his divine power and his ability to mobilize the human and material resources of the empire in service of the cosmic order. A king who could not build, or who allowed the hydraulic infrastructure to degrade, or who lost military conflicts with neighboring kingdoms, was a king whose divine legitimacy was visibly in question. The 13th century was a period of sustained military pressure on the Khmer Empire from multiple directions. The Cham people of what is now central Vietnam had sacked Angkor in 1177 CE, a traumatic event that left deep marks on Khmer political culture. Jayavarman VII, who retook the city and launched the massive building program that produced Bayon and many other structures, responded to the trauma with an intensity of construction remarkable even by Khmer standards. According to inscriptional records from his reign, he commissioned hospitals across the empire, roads and rest houses, and temples, building without stopping until his death, sometime around 1218 CE. The scale of construction during his reign was extraordinary. It was also, researchers now believe, a significant factor in the weakening of the hydraulic infrastructure. The labor that built temples was labor that was not available for canal maintenance and embankment repair. The resources that went into the massive stone construction projects of the late 12th and early 13th centuries were resources that were not available for the ongoing engineering work that kept the water system functioning. The hydraulic network had always required continuous investment. During the great building campaigns, that investment was diverted. This is not a criticism of Jayavarman VII. He was responding to real threats in the way that his political culture and his theology required him to respond. Building was power. Building was legitimacy. Building was the visible proof that the king was the divine center around which the world was organized. To stop building would have been to admit weakness at the moment, when weakness was most dangerous. But the hydraulic network did not care about legitimacy. It cared about maintenance, and maintenance was falling behind. After his death, the Khmer Empire entered a period of political instability marked by succession disputes, religious tensions between different traditions, and increasing military pressure from the rising Thai kingdoms to the north and west. The Sukhothai kingdom and later the Ayutthaya kingdom were expanding at the expense of Khmer territory, and the military campaigns required to respond to this expansion drew further on the resources that the hydraulic network needed. A succession of rulers who each needed to demonstrate legitimacy through construction. In a context where the resources available for construction were contracting, is a recipe for a particular kind of institutional exhaustion. Each king built what he could. Each king deferred the maintenance problems that were less visible and less politically urgent than a new temple wall. And the deferred problems accumulated, year by year, decade by decade, into a weight that the system could no longer carry. The system's logic was internally consistent. It was simply optimized for a world that was no longer the world the system was living in. For the Ancestral Puebloans, the human factor looks different, because the social structure of the Chaco system was different from the hierarchical organization of Angkor in ways that matter for understanding what happened. Chaco Canyon was not a city in the sense that Angkor was a city. The great houses were not primarily residential. The number of people who actually lived in the canyon at any given time appears to have been relatively small compared to the scale of the construction. What Chaco was, based on the current state of the evidence, was a ritual and administrative center, a place that drew people for ceremonies and exchanges, where the goods and the knowledge and the social connections of an enormous region were concentrated and redistributed. This kind of center depends on something that is more fragile than stone walls. It depends on agreement, on the shared belief that the center is worth orienting toward, that the journey to Chaco and the contribution of labor and goods to its great houses is worthwhile, that the ceremonies performed there are valuable enough to justify the cost. When that belief weakened, the center could not hold itself together by force. It had no army. It had no coercive apparatus of the kind that Angkor's royal court could deploy. What it had was the accumulated weight of generations of shared practice and shared meaning. And when the drought of the mid-12th century made the cost of participation rise and the apparent benefits fall, that weight was not enough. There is evidence in the archaeological record of violence at several sites in the San Juan region during the 12th and 13th centuries. Sites showing evidence of conflict, of burned structures, of communities under acute stress, have been documented at a number of locations. The violence appears to have been episodic rather than continuous, but it is present, and it complicates any narrative of simple, peaceful migration. What the evidence suggests is social stress of a kind that goes beyond drought. Communities that are merely short of water do not necessarily turn on their neighbors. Communities that are competing for resources that are no longer sufficient for everyone, or that are fracturing along lines of internal tension that the prosperity of the good years had kept submerged, can break in ways that make an already difficult situation dramatically worse. The social fabric of the Chaco system, the network of relationships and obligations and shared beliefs that held 60,000 square miles of communities in a functioning relationship with one another and with the canyon at the center, appears to have torn, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic event, but gradually, in a process whose end result was the dissolution of the most ambitious social and architectural project in the pre-Columbian history of North America. What came after was not nothing. The descendants of the people who built Chaco built other things, in other places, and their traditions continued and evolved into the living cultures of today's Pueblo peoples. But the particular vision that Chaco represented, of a regional network centered on a canyon in the high desert, organized around ceremonies and trade and astronomical knowledge, that vision did not come again. The Norse Greenland case presents the human factor in its starkest form. The question that researchers have returned to repeatedly is this: the Inuit people, who arrived in Greenland around the same time the climate was beginning to cool, did not abandon Greenland. They survived the Little Ice Age. They adapted to it. They developed technologies and subsistence strategies precisely suited to a landscape of cold and ice and limited growing seasons. And those strategies worked well enough that their descendants are still living in Greenland today. Why did the Norse adapt differently? The question sounds simple. The answer is considerably more complicated. There is evidence that the Norse and the Inuit did interact, and that some exchange of knowledge and technology occurred. Norse artifacts have been found in Inuit archaeological contexts, and Inuit artifacts have been found in Norse contexts. The relationship was not one of complete isolation, but the extent to which the Norse adopted Inuit technologies that might have extended the viability of their settlements appears to have been limited relative to what was available to them. Researchers have proposed several explanations for this, and it is important to note that none of them is entirely settled. One explanation focuses on cultural identity. The Norse Greenlanders defined themselves as Europeans, as Christians, as participants in a wider civilization that they maintained connection to through trade and ecclesiastical ties. The available evidence suggests that shifting wholesale to the way of life practiced by the Inuit would have required abandoning an identity that the community had maintained for 4 centuries. That is not a small thing to ask of any community. Another explanation focuses on economic structure. The Norse Greenland economy was oriented toward producing luxury goods for the European market. Shifting to subsistence hunting would have meant dismantling the economic logic around which Greenland's connection to Europe was organized. And as long as that connection seemed viable, the incentive to make such a shift was limited. A third explanation focuses on the European end of the relationship. As African elephant ivory became more available through Portuguese trade routes in the 15th century, the demand for walrus ivory in European markets declined. The economic foundation of Norse Greenland's trade relationship with Europe was eroding precisely as the climate was making survival more difficult. The Greenlanders may have found themselves caught between a European economy that no longer needed what they produced and a landscape that was becoming progressively less hospitable to the way of life they had built. None of these explanations fully accounts for the completeness of what followed. What the evidence does show is that by the mid-15th century, the community that had maintained those stone churches and those farm fields for 400 years was no longer there. Whether individuals found other paths, whether some were absorbed into Inuit communities, whether some returned to Iceland or Norway, the historical record does not clearly say. The human factor, in all 3 cases, is not a story of failure in any simple moral sense. It is a story of societies responding to stress in ways that were shaped by their own internal logic, their own values and assumptions and power structures, in ways that made certain kinds of adaptation possible and other kinds of adaptation very difficult. The Khmer built because building was what legitimacy required. The Chicoans organized because organization was what the vision of a regional center required. The Norse held to their European identity because that identity was what they understood themselves to be. These were not wrong choices in any absolute sense. They were the choices that the internal logic of each society made available, and when the external world changed faster than the internal logic could adapt, the gap between what the societies needed to do and what they were structured to do became, in each case, too wide to bridge. The pressure came from outside. The response came from within. And the distance between those 2 things is where the story lives. Chapter 7. The systems that were too perfect. There is a kind of beauty that contains its own ending. A bridge so elegantly engineered that every component carries exactly the load it was designed for, with nothing left over. A machine so precisely calibrated that every part moves in perfect relation to every other part, with no slack, no redundancy, no room for error. These things are beautiful in the way that only things without waste can be beautiful, and they are fragile in exactly the same proportion. The Khmer hydraulic network was that kind of beautiful. It had been built over centuries, each generation adding to and refining what the previous generation had left. By the 13th century, it was a system in which every component was doing its job precisely. The berets captured the monsoon. The canals distributed the water. The sluice gates controlled the flow. The embankments held the direction. The rice paddies received what they needed, when they needed it, in a landscape that, without the system, would have been too dry for half the year and dangerously flooded for the other half. When it worked, it was extraordinary. When it began to fail, the same precision that had made it extraordinary made the failure move fast. Because the components were so tightly integrated, so precisely calibrated to work together, a failure in one part did not stay in one part. It traveled. A silted canal reduced water flow downstream. Reduced flow meant less water reaching the paddies that depended on that canal. Less water meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant less surplus. Less surplus meant less labor available for maintenance. Less maintenance meant more silted canals. The spiral had no natural floor. The Chaco system had its own version of this tightness, though it looked completely different from the outside. The great houses of Chaco were not self-sufficient agricultural communities. They depended on food imports from outlying communities within the regional network. The outlying communities depended on the ceremonial and administrative functions of the canyon for the social connections and the redistribution of goods that made participation in the network worthwhile. Remove the surplus from the outlying communities, and the contributions to the center fell. When the contributions fell, the center's ability to fulfill its redistributive function declined. When the center's function declined, the incentive for peripheral communities to maintain their connection to it weakened. No redundancy. No simpler version of the Chaco system that could have kept functioning with less. It worked at the level of complexity it had reached. Or it did not work at all. The Norse Greenland settlements depended on the European trade connection for iron and timber that the landscape could not provide. They depended on the walrus ivory market for the economic basis of that trade. They depended on a climate hospitable enough to maintain the cattle herds that were the foundation of their agricultural existence. Remove any one of these dependencies, and the others became harder to maintain. Remove two simultaneously, and the margin for survival contracted to almost nothing. 3 systems, 3 different landscapes, 3 completely different ways of organizing human life. The same underlying fragility. There is a word for what all 3 of these systems had in common. And the word is optimization. Each had been optimized over generations for the conditions it was built for. The optimization was what made them impressive. You cannot build a hydraulic network that feeds hundreds of thousands of people without eliminating every inefficiency, without tightening every tolerance, without making every component do more with less. You cannot organize 60,000 square miles of semi-arid landscape into a functioning economic network without a level of coordination that leaves you exposed if the coordination fails. You cannot build a functioning farming community at the edge of the habitable world without a dependence on external connections that makes you vulnerable if those connections weaken. The optimization was the achievement. The optimization was the vulnerability. These were the same thing. Now, consider what happened to the knowledge inside these systems when the systems began to fail. The Khmer hydraulic network was not a natural system. It was an engineered system. And like all engineered systems, it required people who understood how it worked. People who knew where the critical junctions were, who recognized the early signs of a failing sluice gate before the failure became catastrophic. Who remembered which canal had flooded in the drought of 30 years ago, and what had worked to repair it? That knowledge did not live in stone. It lived in people. In the institutional memory of the engineers and administrators who supervised the maintenance work, passed down through training and apprenticeship and the accumulated experience of working the same system year after year. When the political instability of the 13th century disrupted those institutions, the knowledge began to thin, not dramatically, not all at once. But the training of new engineers was interrupted. The experienced administrators who knew the system's history were replaced by people who did not. The network of people who knew which channel needed dredging in which season, who could read the water level in a beret and know what it meant for the harvest 3 months from now. That network grew smaller with each generation of disruption. And a hydraulic system maintained by people with incomplete knowledge of how it works is a hydraulic system that is failing in slow motion. The Chaco system faced the same erosion of knowledge, in a different form. The ceremonies and exchanges that gave the canyon its meaning were not written down. They lived in the memories of the people who performed them, in the trained knowledge of the specialists who understood the astronomical alignments and the ritual calendars and the relationships between the great houses and the outlying communities. When the network began to dissolve, when the journeys to Chaco became less frequent and the ceremonies less attended, the knowledge that depended on collective practice began to fade at the edges. A ceremony performed by fewer people is not the same ceremony. A road walked by fewer travelers is still a road. For a while. And then, it is not. For Norse Greenland, the knowledge loss was perhaps the most immediate. The trade connections with Norway and Iceland were not just economic lifelines. They were how the community maintained its connection to the accumulated technological and cultural knowledge of the wider European world. When those connections weakened, the community became more isolated not just economically, but intellectually. Less able to learn from the adaptations being made elsewhere. Less able to import the tools and techniques that might have extended its viability. Isolation and knowledge loss fed each other, as they always do. What the three stories share. Underneath the specific details of hydraulics and desert roads and Arctic farms, is this: the most sophisticated thing a civilization builds is not its largest structure. It is the system of knowledge and practice and institutional memory that keeps the largest structure standing. Stone endures. Knowledge is fragile. And when the knowledge goes, the stone follows. Slowly. In the particular way that things fall apart, when no one who understands them is left to hold them together. The Khmer hydraulic network did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because the people who understood how to maintain it were no longer there in sufficient numbers to do so. The Chaco system did not dissolve because the vision behind it was wrong. It dissolved because the shared belief that made the vision real required continuous renewal, and the conditions for that renewal were withdrawn. The Norse settlements did not end because the people who built them lacked courage or ingenuity. They ended because the specific combination of knowledge, connection, and climate that had made those settlements viable narrowed, year by year, to a point beyond which the community could not continue in the form it had taken. What ended in each case was not the people. It was the particular form of organization that had held them together. The precise and beautiful and fragile architecture of a way of life optimized for conditions that did not last. The bridge held every load it was designed to hold. And when the world changed, it was not the bridge that was wrong. It was the world. Chapter 8. The limits of what we can conclude. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that is harder to practice than it sounds. It is the honesty of saying, clearly, and without hedging in either direction, here is what we know. Here is what we do not know. And here is the difference between those two things. That distinction sounds simple. It is not simple. The pressure in any contested subject runs strongly toward one of two easier positions. Either everything is explained and the mystery is closed, or everything is uncertain and the mystery remains permanently open. Both of those positions are more comfortable than the one that says some things are established. Some things are genuinely uncertain. And the line between them matters enormously if you want to understand what actually happened. So let us spend some time at the actual boundary. Begin with what is firmly established. The climate record for all three regions during the relevant period is not in serious dispute among specialists. The tree ring data from the American Southwest documents prolonged drought in the 12th century and the severe drought period of the late 13th century with a precision that is among the best available for any pre-Columbian climate reconstruction. The study by Brendan Buckley and colleagues, documenting monsoon variability in mainland Southeast Asia, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has been cited extensively, and its core findings have not been seriously challenged. The Greenland ice core record of cooling temperatures beginning in the 13th century is one of the most robust climate records available for the medieval period anywhere on Earth. The archaeological evidence for the transformation or abandonment of each of these sites is also not in serious dispute. Chaco Canyon was largely depopulated by 1200 CE. The Mesa Verde region was abandoned by 1300 CE. The hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor shows clear evidence of degradation and modification during the 14th and 15th centuries. The northeastern settlement was no longer occupied by the mid-15th century at the latest. These are findings supported by decades of excavation, radiocarbon dating, and stratigraphic analysis by researchers working across multiple institutions and multiple countries. The correlation between the climate stress and the archaeological evidence for disruption is real and meaningful. Now here is where the honest account requires a careful step back. Correlation is not causation, and the correlation between climate stress and societal disruption, real as it is, does not establish that climate stress caused the disruption in any simple or complete sense. The causal chain from drought or cooling temperatures to the specific forms of transformation or abandonment that each society experienced runs through human decisions, social structures, economic systems, and political dynamics that the climate record alone cannot illuminate. This is not a minor qualification. It is central to understanding these stories correctly. Consider the American Southwest. The drought period of the late 13th century is one of the best documented climate events in pre-Columbian North American history. But the northern Colorado Plateau was not uniformly abandoned in response to it. Some communities persisted through the drought and beyond. The Rio Grande Valley, which received somewhat more reliable moisture, became the destination for large-scale migration. And communities there survived and continued developing their traditions. The drought created pressure. The response to that pressure was shaped by local conditions, social networks, the availability of alternative locations, and a host of other factors that varied across the landscape. Saying that drought caused the abandonment of Chaco and Mesa Verde is a simplification that flattens this complexity into a story that is easier to tell but less accurate than the full picture. The same qualification applies to Angkor, the climate reconstruction documents, drought, and flooding. The lidar analysis documents, hydraulic infrastructure under stress. But the precise relationship between those climate events and the political decisions of specific Khmer rulers, the military pressures from neighboring kingdoms, the religious transitions that disrupted institutional continuity, the specific sequence in which different components of the hydraulic network failed, all of this is a chain of causation that the current evidence does not allow researchers to trace with confidence. We know the climate stressed the system. We know the system failed. The detailed mechanism connecting those two facts is not fully established. For Norse Greenland, the honest account requires acknowledging something that popular treatments of the story often do not. The disappearance of the Norse settlements is, in important respects, less well explained than the transformations of the other two societies. The Khmer transformation can be traced in the archaeological record through the southward shift of population and political center. The ancestral Puebloan migration can be traced through the movement of ceramic traditions and architectural styles from the northern Colorado Plateau toward the Rio Grande Valley. The Norse Greenland disappearance leaves no comparable trail. We do not know whether the population died in place, returned to Iceland or Norway, was absorbed into Inuit communities, or some combination of all three. What we can say is that the combination of climate cooling, economic disruption through the decline of the walrus ivory market, and the limitations in the community's adaptation to Arctic conditions created a set of simultaneous stresses that the settlements were not able to survive as a recognizable entity. Beyond that, the specific causal chain remains genuinely uncertain. There is also a set of claims about all three of these societies that circulates in popular accounts and that the evidence does not support. The idea that the ancestral Puebloans simply vanished, leaving their cliff dwellings overnight with food still on the table, is not supported by the archaeology. The depopulation of the northern Colorado Plateau unfolded over decades, not a sudden event, and the people who left did not disappear. They moved to places where their descendants still live today. The idea that Angkor was swallowed by the jungle and forgotten is not accurate. The temples were never entirely abandoned. Buddhist monks maintained a presence at Angkor Wat continuously from the 15th century onward. The site was known to Cambodian people throughout the period of Western ignorance about it. When the French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited in 1860 CE and described Angkor Wat as a discovery, he was discovering something that local people had never lost track of. The idea that the Norse Greenlanders simply refused to adapt is a simplification that the evidence does not fully support. The Greenlanders did adapt, within the constraints of their economic and cultural situation. The question of why those adaptations were insufficient is genuinely complex and genuinely unresolved. There is one more thing the honest account requires acknowledging, and it concerns the three civilization framing of this video itself. The fact that these three societies experienced stress during the same broad century is real. The fact that this period was one of significant climate disruption across much of the Northern Hemisphere is real, but the framing of the three cases as expressions of a single phenomenon is a narrative choice, not a finding of the research. The societies were different. The stresses they faced were different in their specific form. The ways in which they were or were not able to respond were different. The outcomes were different in important ways. Holding them together in the same analysis reveals patterns that studying each one individually might miss. And those patterns are genuinely interesting and genuinely illuminating. But the patterns are ways of seeing, not facts about the world that exist independently of the analysis. This video does not argue that one single event or one single cause ended all three societies. What it has tried to do is follow each story carefully enough that the genuine complexity becomes visible, and then ask what that complexity looks like when the three stories are held up together. What you do with that is yours. The past is not a lesson in any simple sense. It is a set of stories whose endings are known and whose causes remain, in important and honest ways, under discussion. The discussion is ongoing. The researchers are still working. The questions are still open, and anyone who tells you otherwise is offering you a cleaner story than the evidence provides. Chapter 9. The People Who Stayed. History has a tendency to focus on endings. On the last king and the last inscription, and the last ship and the last recorded name. On the moment when the documentary trail goes cold and the silence begins. This is understandable. Endings are dramatic. They seem to promise, if we can understand them well enough, some kind of lesson about how things fall apart. But endings, in the history of human societies, are rarely as complete as they appear from a distance. Behind the silence of the abandoned temple or the empty settlement, there are almost always people who did not leave, people who transformed what they had inherited into something new, people whose descendants are alive today and who carry, in their languages and their ceremonies and their relationships with specific landscapes, the living continuation of what the endings seem to have terminated. Two of the three societies we have been following have those descendants. The third does not, or at least not in any form that the current evidence can trace. And the difference between the two cases illuminates something important about what the word collapse actually means, and what it obscures. Begin with the Pueblo peoples. The Hopi people of northeastern Arizona are the descendants of Ancestral Puebloans. This is not a matter of scholarly inference. It is part of Hopi identity, embedded in their oral histories and their ceremonial life and their relationship to specific places in the landscape that their ancestors built and left. Hopi oral traditions speak of migrations, of the movement of clans across the Colorado Plateau over generations, stopping at various places to fulfill ceremonial obligations before continuing to the mesas where the Hopi villages stand today. The migrations that the oral traditions describe align, in their broad outline, with the archaeological record of ancestral Puebloan movement away from the northern Colorado Plateau during the 12th and 13th centuries. The village of Oribe on Third Mesa in northeastern Arizona has been continuously occupied since approximately 1100 CE, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. The people who live there today are not the descendants of a society that collapsed. They are the continuation of a society that moved. The Zuni people of western New Mexico maintain a similarly direct connection to the ancestral Puebloan past. Zuni oral traditions identify specific great houses in the Chaco system as places associated with their ancestors. And Zuni ceremonial practices preserve elements that researchers have traced to the Chacoan period. The various Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley, whose villages line the river from Taos in the north to Isleta in the south, are all descended from the population movements of the 12th and 13th centuries. When the people of the northern Colorado Plateau left, they did not disappear into the landscape. They moved along routes that their trade networks had already established, toward places where water was more reliable, toward communities that could absorb and integrate new arrivals. The knowledge that had built Pueblo Bonito and carved the roads through the desert did not die at Chaco. It traveled. It adapted. It found new forms in new places. And those forms are still alive in the pottery traditions and the ceremonial calendars and the architectural practices and the relationships with the land that characterize Pueblo communities today. When a Hopi potter shapes clay using techniques that can be traced back through the archaeological record to the Chacoan period, she is not performing an act of historical recreation. She is doing what her grandmother did, and her grandmother's grandmother, in a chain of transmission that the Great Drought and the abandonment of the Northern Plateau did not break. The chain bent. It moved. It found new ground. It did not break. The Cambodian case is different in its specifics but similar in its essential character. The Khmer people did not disappear when the administrative center of their state shifted away from Angkor. The temples were not abandoned to the jungle by a population that had ceased to exist. The population remained in Cambodia, as it has remained continuously to the present day. The traditions that Angkor had expressed, the religious practices, the artistic conventions, the relationship between royal authority and sacred architecture, were transformed and continued under new political arrangements in new locations. Theravada Buddhism, which had been gaining influence in mainland Southeast Asia during the period of Angkor's decline, became the dominant religious tradition of the Khmer state that succeeded the Great Temple-building era. The new tradition was less oriented toward monumental stone construction and more toward wooden temples and community practice. The shift was significant, but it was a transformation of a living tradition, not the death of it. The royal palace of Phnom Penh, built in the 19th century, but following architectural conventions that trace their lineage to the Angkorian period, stands today as the seat of the Cambodian government. The classical dance forms performed at the courts of Angkorian kings are still performed. The Khmer language, in which the inscriptions of Angkor Wat were carved, is the official language of Cambodia and is spoken by the majority of its population. The faces on the towers of Bayon gaze outward over a landscape still inhabited by the descendants of the people who carved them. Angkor Wat is not a ruin in the sense that Pompeii is a ruin, a preserved moment of a civilization that no longer exists anywhere. It is a living religious site, maintained and visited by Cambodian Buddhists, for whom it is not a monument to a lost civilization, but a sacred place that belongs to their ongoing tradition. The continuity is real. The transformation is real. What ended at Angkor was not the Khmer people or the Khmer tradition. What ended was a specific form of political and hydraulic organization, a specific relationship between royal power and sacred architecture and the management of water across a vast urban landscape. That form was remarkable. Its ending was a genuine loss. But it was not the ending of a people. It was the transformation of one expression of a culture into another. The Norse Greenland case is different, profoundly, uncomfortably different. There are no descendants of the Norse Greenland community who maintain a continuous connection to the eastern and western settlements, the way that Hopi people maintain a continuous connection to Chaco Canyon, or Cambodian people maintain a continuous connection to Angkor. The stone churches of the eastern settlement are not maintained by a community that traces its identity to their builders. The farm fields of the Norse settlers are not still being worked by the great-great-grandchildren of the families who first cleared them. The community ended, not metaphorically, not in the sense that it transformed into something unrecognizable, in the sense that the people who had maintained it for 400 years were no longer there. And no community has emerged in the centuries since that carries forward their specific traditions and their specific identity in any traceable way. This is why Norse Greenland is the hardest of the three cases to hold alongside the others without feeling the asymmetry. The Hopi potter carrying the traditions of Chaco forward through 700 years of continuous practice is a fact that changes how you understand the ancestral Puebloan story. The Cambodian family making offerings at Angkor Wat in the 21st century is a fact that changes how you understand the Khmer story. The Norse Greenland settlements have no equivalent. The stone walls of the Falsey Church stand in a landscape where no one is carrying that tradition forward. Some researchers have suggested that Norse individuals or families may have been absorbed into Inuit communities in the final years of the settlements, and that genetic traces of Norse ancestry might be detectable in Greenland Inuit populations. The evidence for this remains limited, and the conclusions are disputed. The Inuit oral traditions of Greenland do contain stories of encounters with people called kavdlunate, a term used for Europeans. And some of these stories describe conflict, and some describe coexistence. Whether any of them describe the actual absorption of Norse Greenlanders into Inuit communities in the 15th century is not established. What the current evidence allows us to say is that the Norse Greenland community ended as a recognizable entity, and that the specific traditions it carried did not continue in Greenland after its disappearance. That is a real ending. The Norse tradition continued robustly in Iceland and Norway and across Scandinavia. The specific community of Greenland, the 400-year experiment in European settlement at the edge of the habitable world, ended without continuation in the place where it had been built. The difference between the three cases, between the transformation that left living descendants at Chaco and Angkor and the disappearance that left only stone walls in Greenland, is not easily explained by climate or economics alone. It may be, at the deepest level, a story about what a community needs in order to transform rather than disappear when its existing form becomes untenable. The ancestral Puebloans had a landscape to move into, and they had the knowledge and the social networks to make that movement work. The Khmer had a tradition capacious enough to find new expressions when the old one became unsustainable. The Norse Greenlanders may have had neither available to them in sufficient time. Transformation requires options. It requires the knowledge of how to change, and the social structures to make change possible, and a destination that the changed community can reach. The people who stayed, whether they stayed by remaining in place or by carrying their traditions into new landscapes, are the evidence that what we call collapse is often not the death of something, but the ending of one particular form of something that was in the process of becoming something else. Two of these three stories have that kind of ending. The third does not. And the difference between them is the full weight of what the word collapse carries. When you have spent enough time with the evidence to feel the difference between transformation and disappearance, between a tradition that bent and continued, and a community that reached the end of what it was able to do, and stopped. Chapter 10. 3 Silences. 1 Mirror. Hold the 3 stories together for a moment. Not separately, the way we have been following them through the previous chapters. Hold them together simultaneously. The way you might hold 3 photographs up to the light at once and look for what they share. The Khmer engineer, standing at the edge of a silting canal in the 14th century, watching the water move more slowly than it should, knowing that the labor to clear it has been redirected to a temple construction project that the king needs finished before the rainy season. He knows the canal needs attention. He knows what happens if it does not get it. He does not have the authority, to stop the temple. He watches the water slow. The ancestral Puebloan elder watching the sky in the third consecutive year of inadequate rainfall, feeling the weight of a decision that is no longer a question of whether, but of when. She has watched the storage jars grow lighter. She has watched the younger families leave first. Unbeun. Their departure, making the ones who remain feel the absence more sharply with each passing season. The Norse farmer in the western settlement in the mid-14th century, counting the hay bales in the storage barn and calculating, for the third winter in a row, that the number is not sufficient for the number of cattle he is trying to keep alive. He knows what this means. He has known for 2 winters. The calculation does not get easier the more times you do it. 3 people, 3 places, no knowledge of each other. Each one standing inside a system that had worked for generations and was no longer working, holding tools that their way of life had given them for solving problems, finding that those tools were not adequate to the problem that had arrived. None of them could see the full shape of what was happening. None of us ever can. That is the first thing the mirror shows. The people inside a transformation do not experience it as history. They experience it as a series of individual days, each one demanding its own response, each one feeling like a problem that might still be solved if the right decision is made. The transformation only becomes visible in retrospect. When someone with the distance of centuries can look at the whole arc and say, "There, that is where the trajectory changed." The people living the trajectory do not have that distance. They have today, and tomorrow, and the question of whether tomorrow will be enough. Now hold the 3 stories together, not as individual tragedies, but as a pattern. Each of these societies had built something extraordinary. Each had done it by becoming very good at a specific way of relating to its landscape, by developing the knowledge and the infrastructure and the social organization needed to extract from that landscape everything it could provide. Each had optimized, over generations, for the conditions it was built for, and each had reached a point where the conditions it was built for were no longer the conditions it was living in. The optimization had worked. The world had changed. The distance between those 2 facts was where each of these societies met its particular kind of ending. That distance is not unique to the 13th and 14th centuries. It is not a problem that belongs to civilizations of stone and water and walrus ivory. It is a recurring feature of what happens when systems built for one world encounter a different one. When the thing that made you strong becomes, in changed conditions, the thing that makes adaptation difficult. When the knowledge that sustained you for generations becomes, in new circumstances, the thing that obscures the path forward because it points so confidently toward what worked before. Look into this long enough and something may begin to feel familiar. Not as prophecy, not as a warning dressed in the language of history, as a pattern, quiet, consistent, observable across enough different times and places that it deserves to be taken seriously as a feature of how complex human systems behave. There is no clean lesson here. The Khmer were not wrong to build temples. The Chacoans were not wrong to organize a regional network around a ceremonial center. The Norse were not wrong to maintain their European identity at the edge of the world. These were not mistakes. They were expressions of what each society understood itself to be, enacted with skill and commitment and genuine achievement. The difficulty is not that they made bad choices. The difficulty is that good choices, made in one world, do not always survive the transition to another. That is what the mirror holds. Not a verdict, not a lesson that, if learned correctly, will prevent what happened to Angkor and Chaco and Norse Greenland from happening again. There is no such lesson, because the specific forms of complexity and vulnerability change with every generation while the underlying dynamic remains. What the mirror offers is something smaller and more honest. The recognition that every way of life is a specific solution to a specific set of conditions. That the solution works until the conditions change. That the change when it comes, is rarely dramatic at first. It arrives as a silting canal, as a third dry year, as a hay supply that falls slightly short for the third winter in a row. It arrives as a series of individual days, each one demanding its own response. And somewhere in those days, the trajectory changes, not with a crash, with a quiet shift, barely visible from inside, that only becomes legible from the outside. Looking back, centuries later, with the particular clarity that distance and loss provide. 3 silences. 1 mirror. Look into it as long as you can. Then let your breathing slow. And hold, before you drift. The thought that the people inside those transformations were not statistics or data points or cautionary examples. They were people, waking up every morning to the specific weight of their specific lives, trying, as people always try, to make tomorrow work. Chapter 11. What the new tools are finding. The stories we have been telling tonight are not finished. That is not a figure of speech. The picture of what happened to these 3 civilizations has been changing. And it has been changing faster than most people outside the specialist literature realize. Because the tools available for recovering the past have undergone a transformation in the last 2 decades that is genuinely without precedent in the history of archaeology. We are living, right now, in what may be the golden age of discovery about the ancient world. Begin with Angkor, because the changes there are perhaps the most dramatic. The Cambodian Archaeological Lidar Initiative conducted aerial surveys of the Angkor region between 2012 and 2015. It did not merely confirm what ground-based archaeology had already established. It revealed an entirely different picture of the scale and organization of the Angkor urban complex, a low-density urban landscape of approximately 1,000 square kilometers, structured around the hydraulic network in ways that ground survey had only partially captured. The surveys revealed channels that had not been previously identified. They revealed the precise geometry of the Barre network. They revealed the distribution of residential occupation across the urban area at a level of detail that transformed researchers' understanding of how the city had been organized. And they revealed something that has significant implications for understanding what happened. Evidence of modifications to the hydraulic network made in haste. Channels redirected in ways inconsistent with the original design. Embankments reinforced unevenly. The physical signatures of engineers working to address problems that were outpacing their capacity to respond. Seen from above, across the entire landscape simultaneously. The archaeology of a system under stress became visible in a way that no amount of ground-level excavation could have achieved. A subsequent study, published in Science Advances in 2020 by a team from the University of Sydney, combined the LiDAR data with sediment cores extracted from the floors of the major barrays and canals. The sediment cores told a story in layers. Deep layers, with fine, consist sedimentation, the signature of a well-maintained system in its years of greatest function. Then layers showing coarser, more irregular deposition, reduced maintenance, periodic flooding breaking through. Then, layers showing the signature of abandonment, the rapid infilling that occurs when a channel is no longer being actively managed. When the water that was once directed with such precision is simply going where it will. The cores gave the lidar data a temporal dimension. Not just what had changed, but roughly when it had changed, and in what sequence different parts of the system had failed. The picture that emerged was of a hydraulic network degrading from the late 14th century onward, experiencing acute stress during the drought and flood cycles documented in the tree ring record, and reaching a state of effective non-function by the mid-15th century. This precision was not available to researchers 10 years ago. It is available now for the Ancestral Puebloans, a multi-institutional research collaboration known as the Village Ecodynamics Project, has used computer modeling combined with paleoclimate reconstruction and the detailed archaeological database of the northern Colorado Plateau model how communities might have responded to the climate variability of the 12th and 13th centuries. The approach places individual households and communities into a reconstructed environment and runs the model forward in time to see what collective patterns emerge from individual decisions. The results have been able to reproduce, with considerable accuracy, the patterns of community formation, movement, and dissolution visible in the archaeological record. The finding that stands out is not the one about drought. It is the one about connection. Communities that were well connected to other communities through kinship and trade and ceremonial ties were better able to respond to local drought by moving toward areas of better moisture. Communities that were more isolated faced worse outcomes. The social fabric of the Chaco system, which had created connections across 60,000 square miles, may have paradoxically both increased the vulnerability of the system as a whole and provided individual communities with the network resources they needed to survive its dissolution. The people were not simply victims of a drought. They were navigating a collapse of connection, using whatever connections remained. For Norse Greenland, ancient DNA analysis, which has become dramatically more powerful in the last decade, is beginning to be applied to skeletal material from Norse Greenland archaeological contexts. Recent analysis of remains from Norse Greenland burial sites found genetic affinities consistent with Scandinavian and British Isles origin. The sample sizes are small. The analysis is ongoing, and researchers are careful to note that limited results do not establish the full picture of what may have occurred in the settlement's final years. The question of what happened to the Norse Greenlanders at the end is not answered, but it is now a question that the science can begin to ask in new ways. There is one more line of research that bears on all three stories simultaneously. A series of large volcanic eruptions in the early 13th century, including a massive eruption in 1257 CE, whose source has been identified as the Samalas volcano in what is now Indonesia, injected enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere reflects sunlight and causes temporary cooling of the Earth's surface. The 1257 Samalas eruption is one of the largest volcanic events of the last 7,000 years by the measure of sulfur dioxide injection, and its climatic effects are detectable in the Greenland and Antarctic ice cores as a prominent sulfate spike. A study published in the journal Nature in 2012 by a team led by Gifford Miller of the University of Colorado documented evidence that a cluster of volcanic eruptions in the early 13th century may have triggered a self-sustaining expansion of Arctic sea ice that contributed to the onset of the Little Ice Age, through a feedback loop in which volcanic cooling promotes sea ice expansion, which increases the reflectivity of the ocean surface, which causes further cooling, which promotes further sea ice expansion. If this mechanism operated as proposed, then the climatic deterioration that stressed the Norse Greenland settlements was not simply a gradual natural trend. It was partly triggered by a specific and datable event on the other side of the planet, which set in motion a feedback process that the climate system could not easily reverse. The fate of a small farming community at the edge of the habitable world, connected through a chain of atmospheric and oceanic feedbacks to a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, in a place so far away that the farmers in Greenland could not have known it existed, in a chain of consequence so long and so indirect that no one alive at the time could have traced it. The world has always been more connected than any of its inhabitants knew. The new tools keep showing us this, in forms that no previous generation of researchers had the means to see. The stories are not finished. They are being rewritten, carefully and with increasing precision, by researchers working across 4 continents, in languages and institutions and with instruments that the people who built Angkor and Chaco and the Norse Greenland settlements could not have imagined. Every season of excavation adds something. Every ice core drilled goes a little deeper. Every lidar survey passes over ground that has not yet been fully read. The past is patient, and the tools we are bringing to it have never been sharper. Chapter 12. The Century That Forgot Itself. Let your breathing slow now. We have traveled a long way tonight, and the traveling is almost done. Before you drift, I want to sit with you for a moment in the quiet that follows a long story. In the particular stillness that comes when you have been somewhere far away for a long time and are finding your way back. Somewhere in Cambodia tonight, the stones of Angkor Wat are doing what they have always done in the hours before dawn. They are releasing the heat they absorbed during the day, cooling slowly in the darkness. And the dew that forms on their surfaces in the cooling catches whatever light there is. The stars, if the sky is clear, the faint glow of distant cities, if it is not, and the carved figures in the bas-relief galleries, the half-mile of dancers and warriors and divine figures commissioned 900 years ago, are briefly, quietly luminous. No one is watching. The monks who maintain a residence at the temple are asleep. The visitors, who will arrive at dawn to watch the sunrise over the towers, are not yet there. For a few hours, the temple exists in something close to the silence it inhabited for the long centuries after the shift of the Khmer court southward. The silence is not emptiness. It is full of what was built there, and of what the building meant, and of the generations of human lives that passed through the space between the carved walls and understood themselves, in that passing, to be part of something larger than themselves. Somewhere in New Mexico tonight, the walls of Pueblo Bonito stand in the darkness of Chaco Canyon. The sandstone blocks fitted together with the core and veneer technique that took 200 years to complete. The rooms behind them empty, now. The roof timbers long since collapsed. The turquoise offerings and the macaw bones excavated and catalogued and housed in museums far from the canyon where they were placed. The road runs north from the edge of the canyon, straight into the darkness, 30 feet wide, cut into the bedrock in the places where it crosses the mesa, going nowhere, or going somewhere that we do not yet know how to name. Somewhere in Greenland tonight, the walls of the Valsey Church stand in a landscape of rock and low scrub and the particular quality of northern darkness that is never quite complete in summer and never quite lightened in winter. The walls are roofless. The interior has been open to the sky for 600 years. The grass grows up between the stones of what was once the floor, and the wind moves through the empty windows without resistance. The last recorded Norse presence in Greenland was a wedding in this church, 1408 CE. The record is careful and specific. It names the couple. It names the witnesses. It describes the ceremony in the way that communities describe ceremonies when they believe their institutions are functioning and their records matter. 600 years of silence since then. 3 places. 3 silences. 1 century that forgot itself so thoroughly that the explorers and scholars who came after found these sites and assumed they were looking at mysteries, at ruins of civilizations so ancient and so remote that the connection to living people and living traditions was invisible to them. The connection was always there. At Angkor, it was the monks who had never left. The smoke of their incense rising in the same courtyards where Khmer kings had once received ambassadors from China and Java and India. The continuity so quiet and so constant that Western visitors mistook it for absence. At Chaco, it was the Hopi clan histories that remembered the migrations, that named specific places in the canyon as places their ancestors had lived and left, for reasons that the oral traditions still carry in their own way, in their own language, on their own terms. At Havalse, the silence is more complete. But even there, the Inuit oral traditions of Greenland contain stories of encounters with people from far away. Stories whose possible relationship to the Norse Greenlanders who built that church has not yet been fully traced. Perhaps those stories are there, Perhaps the thread runs further than the current evidence can follow. The past does not always give back what we ask of it, but it rarely gives back nothing. The century that forgot itself did not forget completely. It never does. Memory persists in forms that the people who carry it do not always recognize as memory. A ceramic tradition that can be traced from Chaco Canyon to the Rio Grande Valley through 700 years of continuous practice. A dance form performed at the courts of Cambodia, whose choreography contains movements that can be matched to the figures carved on the walls of Angkor Wat. A word in a language. Perhaps. A story told in winter whose ultimate source is a landscape the storyteller has never seen and does not know existed. The past does not disappear. It goes underground. It waits. And sometimes, with the right tools and the right attention and the right questions, it surfaces again. In a lidar survey that reveals a city beneath the forest canopy, in an ancient DNA analysis that traces a migration across a continent, in a tree ring that records a drought that ended 800 years ago with the precision of a diary entry, I want to leave you with an image. There is a woman alive today, a Hopi woman, whose ancestor, at some remove of generations that the mathematics of deep time makes difficult to specify, carried a pot of water from a spring in what is now southwestern Colorado to a settlement in the Mesa Verde region. This was in the last years before that region was abandoned. In the years of the Great Drought. In the season when the decision was finally made that it was time to go. She did not know that future people would call what was happening a collapse. She knew that the spring was running lower than it had been. She knew that the storage jars in the back room held less than they had held the year before. She knew that her children were the reason for every decision she made. And she made the decision that her descendants needed her to make. She picked up what she could carry. She walked south. She did not look back. And 700 years later, the knowledge of how to shape clay that she carried in her hands is still being carried. In hands that have never touched the soil of the canyon, she left. By people who know. Because their tradition has always known. Where they came from and what it cost to get here. That is the thread. The century that forgot itself, forgot the names and the languages, and the specific details of what had been built and why. It forgot the engineering logic of the hydraulic network, and the meaning of the astronomical alignments, and the identity of the faces on the towers of Bayonne. It did not forget the knowledge of how to shape clay. It did not forget the movement of the dancer's hands. It did not forget the story of the migration. Even when the story was told so many times and carried so far that the canyon it began in became a place in a story rather than a place on a map. The knowledge that matters most is the hardest kind to destroy. It lives in hands and voices and the particular quality of attention that a community passes from one generation to the next in the daily practice of being itself. The great structures fall. The small knowledge continues. In 2 out of 3 of the stories we told tonight, it continued. And in the one case where it did not continue in any traceable form, the loss is real, and it is permanent, and it deserves to be acknowledged without softening, and without the false comfort of a lesson that the evidence does not actually provide. The Norse farmers of Greenland deserved better than the ending they got. That is all that can honestly be said. The stone walls of the Falsey Church are still standing in the northern darkness. The grass grows up between the stones of the floor. The wind moves through the empty windows. And the question of what happened in those final years, of where the people went, and what they carried, and whether any thread of them persists somewhere in a story that has never been connected to their name. That question is still open. The researchers are still working. The tools are getting sharper. And the past, as always, is patient. Let your breathing slow now. Let the 3 silences settle around you. The jungle night of Cambodia, and the high desert dark of New Mexico, and the northern cold of Greenland. 3 places where something extraordinary was built, and where the building eventually stopped. And let the thread be the last thing you carry into sleep. Not the silence. The thread. It is still there. in the hands of the Hopi potter, in the steps of the Cambodian dancer, in the questions that researchers are still asking tonight, in laboratories and excavation, trenches and archive rooms on 4 continents, about 3 worlds that entered their long silence in the same century and have been waiting, patient as stone, to be fully understood. The century forgot itself. We are remembering it back. Good night. If this story stayed with you, the archive of Hidden Before Dawn has more waiting. Each one begins where the maps end. Sleep well, and dream of what remains.